Well, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 7th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off all their mobile devices as they affect the broadcasting system? The first item of business is to hear evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities on the Scottish Government's update to the Infrastructure Investment Plan 2011, which was published in February of this year. So can I welcome Nicola Sturgeon, Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, Victoria Bruce, Policy Manager for Infrastructure Investment Policy, David Anderson, Head of Planning and Design from Transport Scotland, and Ian Waugh, Head of Capital Planning, Capital and Facilities Division. Can I welcome you all, and Cabinet Secretary, can I invite you to make some opening remarks?
Certainly, Convener, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to update the committee on the progress that is being made on the Infrastructure Investment Plan. Members are aware that we published a revised Infrastructure Investment Plan in December 2011, which set out the priorities for investment and our long-term strategy for the development of public infrastructure. That plan set out why we invest, how we invest, and what we intend to invest in from now through until 2030. Identified key projects and key programmes that we hope will deliver growth, support jobs and keep the economy moving. It also seeks to provide, and this I think is a very important aspect, certainty and transparency to the construction sector by outlining a clear pipeline of capital investments and giving them as much ability as possible to plan ahead. On the 4th of February this year, I published a report on the progress that has been made since the publication of the plan in December 2011, and that report was published sector by sector. We also announced newly updated and more detailed investment pipelines. Those pipelines contain 30 major programmes and over 103, I think to be precise, individual live projects. We will continue to update that on a regular basis on our website, and I'm sure the committee will want to keep a careful eye on that. During 2012, 9 of the major infrastructure projects that were outlined in the 2011 plan with a total value of more than £600 million were completed. These projects are now in use. We're also making good progress on major projects such as the Forth Replacement Crossing, the New South Glasgow Hospitals project and Scotland Schools for the Future programme. Despite the cuts that we all know have been imposed on Scottish capital budgets, cuts of 26% over the 4 years of the spending review, our clear intention is to maximise our own capital spending so that we can support infrastructure investment and jobs, and we'll do that through our capital budget, the MPD pipeline, RAB rail investment and switching resource to capital. As a result of all of that, we're on course in this financial year to spend £3.1 billion on our capital investment programme. This is estimated using the government's input-output economic model to support more than 40,000 jobs across the economy. And that figure will rise in the next financial year to a total of £3.4 billion of capital investment. We're determined to invest to the maximum in our infrastructure, in our schools, our roads, our hospitals, both to stimulate growth in the short term, which is extremely important, but also to lay the foundations for the longer term success of the economy. And ensuring that we have continued momentum in that programme through publication of progress reports and updated investment pipelines is, in my view, an essential part of that approach. So I look forward to answering the committee's questions this morning, and we'd be very happy to come back on a regular basis to the committee as we continue to refine the information that's available and keep the committee and Parliament updated.
Okay, thank you very much. And perhaps I can start the questioning. Does the Scottish Government have an overall estimate of the planned capital investment for the period covered by the IIP?
Obviously, information regarding profile of spend in any 1 year is information that's included in the normal budgetary process, but our expectation based on what we know and would anticipate about budgets into the future, and obviously we can only have certainty about that in terms of this spending review, is that we would expect to spend somewhere in the region of £3 to £4 billion every year on capital investment, and that would encompass the range of sources that I spoke about in my opening remarks: traditional capital, NPD, switching, resource to capital where that's appropriate, the RAB source of funding. So if you take that globally, that gets you to somewhere between £45 and £60 billion over the next 15 years. So that's the global estimate I would make in terms of the overall value of our capital programme in that timescale. But obviously that information becomes more definite and more refined as we go through different years of budget, and when we have the next spending review, which I think only yesterday was confirmed as taking place in June, we'll have greater certainty about the next spending review.
Okay, so can the Scottish Government provide an annual profile of planned investment, identifying the individual programmes of projects underpinning the 3.1 billion figure for 2012-13?
Obviously, as I said a moment ago, we provide information on the profile of spend on capital programmes as part of the annual budget process. So you've got level 2 information, detailed spending plans that are provided for key areas of investment in every portfolio. And if you look at this portfolio, the infrastructure investment in cities portfolio, you've got the profile of spending on key areas, like key areas on roads, for example, and then further information is given about the more detailed spending plans under that heading at level 3 budget figures. So if I can just give you one example from the draft 13-14 budget, that gives details of the expected spend on the Forth replacement crossing over the next 3 years from this financial year through to 2014-15, and the profile of spend on roads improvements. So that detailed profile is obviously laid down in that normal budgetary process. If I can take the 3.1 billion for this financial year that I've spoken about, and as I've said already, that breaks down across traditional capital funding, RAB, rail enhancements, capital receipts, NPD investment and resource to capital switching. And just roughly, that will break down as the vast majority being traditional capital of about 2.7 billion. We've got NPD in there, about 20 million, RAB 82 million, receipts I think around 60 million, resource to capital just over 200 million. So that's the breakdown in terms of the 3.1 billion that I have spoken about for this financial year.
Okay, and in relation to the number of jobs created vis-a-vis the investment, can you confirm that the estimate of jobs created relates to the construction phase of the projects, and whether any assessment has been made of the longer-term impact of the capital investment programme?
The first point I should make, just to be absolutely clear, the 40,000 jobs I spoke about is jobs supported, it's not jobs created. And that is a figure we arrive at through the government's economic input-output model, and that estimates that every £100 million of public sector capital spending would support around 1,400 full-time equivalent Scottish jobs in the wider economy. That includes indirect jobs in the supply chain as well. In relation to your specific question, yes, that figure relates to the construction phase of projects. We don't make an assessment of the longer term impact of capital investment programmes, although we would expect, and I think it stands to reason that we would expect that infrastructure, particularly if you're talking infrastructure around transport, improving the digital infrastructure of the country, energy infrastructure, all of that kind of infrastructure enables businesses to grow, and therefore you would expect that to have a significant positive impact on economic growth and on the support for jobs. But we don't have a similar estimate for the longer term impact of these projects as we can do through the input-output model for the construction phase.
Okay. And does the Scottish Government have evidence from completed projects to support its estimates of jobs created by capital investment activity, where the jobs anticipated to be created by previous projects actually delivered?
We do have some information. I'd be happy to provide the committee with a range of information from some projects that shows the actual kind of jobs supported through some of these projects. I'll give some edited highlights at the moment if it's helpful. I think the first thing to say though is the input-output model that I've spoken about is based on real economic data. So that should give a fairly accurate overall picture. And it improves all the time, our ability to measure things like community benefit, impact on youth employment, for example. But if you look at some of the health projects, for example, that have been supported, the Aberdeen Emergency Care Centre, something important in your own neck of the woods, convener, peak employees on site in that project were 450. And 50% of them were locally based staff, people living or based in the North East. The New South Glasgow Hospitals project, they've got a number of targets in terms of new entrants to the labour market and employment, so a target of 250 new entrant recruits, including 88 apprentices, and they're on track in terms of the overall delivery of that. As at the beginning of this year, that project has created 390 new jobs for people living in and around Glasgow. And again, we know that the majority of those jobs, just short of 80%, have gone to people from the greater Glasgow and Clyde area. So I could go on through some of the individual projects, but it might be more helpful to give the committee some written information around that. Last point I would make is, again, it relates to health. The current Framework Scotland re-procurement exercise that's underway, it will include in the spring of this year, and that's going to include an obligation on the principal supply chain partners to monitor the creation or the support for new jobs, both as a direct and an indirect consequence of the project work, and that will be similar to the kind of monitoring information that we gather or is gathered around the New South Glasgow Hospitals project. So it's not a perfect science is what I'm saying, but there's a lot of work going on to make sure that we can gather project by project as much information as possible to give the backup to the input-output models figures that I've already spoken about. And as I say, I'm happy to provide more information to the committee on that.
And with that, are there lessons learned? Like I've heard from some sources that we don't push enough in terms of the number of apprentices that could be employed on a particular project. So do we kind of keep pushing the boundary?
Yeah, I think we, obviously SFT through the work it does, the government through our own capital investment work, are looking to learn those lessons all the time, because it's an important aspect of our capital investment, not just that we get the capital assets that we are aiming to get to provide the longer term benefit to the social and economic fabric of the country, but that we are getting as much short-term economic benefit out of these projects and out of that spend as possible. And obviously looking at apprenticeships, other opportunities for people coming into the labour market are all important indicators, and we work hard to gather and to improve not just the gathering of that information, but the actual performance around these things.
Okay, thanks. Gordon.
Thanks, Convener. The Scotland Act 2012 provided for the Scottish Government to borrow up to £2.2 billion annually from 2015-16. What impact has the granting of borrowing powers had on the number, scale or timing of projects in the infrastructure investment plan?
Not a great amount, in the sense that the infrastructure investment plan is a massive programme over a large number of years of capital investment. And the convener asked me about the kind of global scale of our capital investment over the next 15 years, which at the upper end is in the region of £60 billion. So clearly a borrowing facility of £2.2 billion is not going to have a massive impact on that, and that the programme we're talking about today is certainly not contingent on those borrowing powers. That said, it's clearly an important step forward for the Parliament to have borrowing powers. I think they're woefully inadequate, and I think the Parliament should have full economic powers, including full powers to use its judgment around how much to borrow. We will obviously start to take decisions around the potential use of borrowing powers once we have, for example, information around the spending review, which will inform those decisions going forward. So it becomes an important part of our future planning, but obviously set at the levels the Scotland Act have set those borrowing powers at, it's not something that has a massive impact in terms of the totality of our capital investment ambitions.
And the £2.2 billion borrowing limit granted to the Scottish Government, how does that compare to the borrowing limit granted to other devolved parliaments?
I can get the precise information in terms of where it ranks, but it's, you know, in terms of the Scottish Government's overall capital investment plan, I'm not saying it's unimportant. I'm certainly not saying we won't make full strategic use of that if that is the appropriate thing to do. But when you look at our global capital investment plan, then borrowing powers of that magnitude are fairly small. And, you know, I think that's an important point, not just in terms of what it enables us to do. I think it's an important point in terms of the overall financial and fiscal responsibility and accountability of this Parliament, which is still far more limited than I would like it to be.
Okay, thanks.
Alex, I'm sorry, did you have a...
Yes, just do we know what strings are attached to the borrowing powers as yet, or are there any restrictions on the use of the capital that would be able to borrow? Because your predecessor had helpfully suggested that there was a host of options available to us once we had those powers, whether it's in terms of increasing the number of projects we had, or bringing forward some of the projects in the plan. Are you any further forward in terms of trying to map out how you're going to use the borrowing powers come 2015-16?
There's obviously a process of implementation of the powers, the financial powers in the Scotland Act. There's a joint Treasury Scottish Government committee. John Swinney and I attended a meeting of that just a few weeks ago. In terms of the borrowing powers, the strings, to use your terminology, are around the limits, the annual limits and the overall global limit that we're able to borrow. I mean, my answers to Gordon MacDonald were not intended to say that we will not use these borrowing powers if that is appropriate. Obviously, government makes assessments of, you know, the correct route for financing projects based on a range of factors and the need to ensure that we're getting value for money for the taxpayer. And, you know, having borrowing powers gives us the ability, or will in the future give us the ability potentially to do things we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do, or perhaps accelerate projects that are already in the pipeline. But we need to take those decisions in an orderly process. And, you know, the spending review, which we'll now have at the end of June, is obviously a key bit of information in terms of the setting the government's own traditional capital budgets for the next few years. And that then allows us to make more strategic judgments about where the borrowing powers, albeit limited borrowing powers, sit in that overall decision making.
Think of one or two projects I'd quite
I'm
like
sure you
to get
can.
accelerated. Yeah.
I'm sure I think I can say with confidence that everybody around this table could think of one or two projects that they might want to see accelerated.
So you're saying, Cabinet Secretary, that you'll factor in
Yes.
the borrowing powers. When is that likely to happen in terms of your review? You talked about later on this summer. It
will happen as we get the spending review information, and as John Swinney factors that into his own spending review decisions and the annual budgetary process that we go through. The other factor here that is worth bearing in mind is the percentage cap we have set in terms of the revenue impact of either capital borrowing or NPD or RAB, where we've got the 5% limit in terms of the proportion of our revenue budget that can go on that. So once we've got borrowing powers, then clearly the use of borrowing powers would still require us to come in below that cap. So it's another tool in the toolbox, and I'm not saying it's an unimportant tool. I'm simply saying that in the context of our overall capital programme and our overall capital ambition, it's got to be seen in perspective. 60 billion or thereabouts programme over the period to 2030, 2.2 billion has to be seen in perspective in the global context of that.
Sure.
Alex.
Thank you, Convener. Notwithstanding the government's apparent desire to acquire further massive crippling debt, I presume that in the meantime, when we are dealing with finite resources, that prioritisation remains a key element of the government's decision-making programme. And in the 2011 plan, the government presented information on how its investment plans delivered against the priorities set out by the Infrastructure Investment Board. Do these same priorities continue to inform the Scottish Government's assessment of investment plans?
Can I say, first of all, we'll leave the accumulation of crippling debt to Westminster governments, who over recent years appear to have been very adept at running up levels of crippling debt. The Scottish Government, whatever powers we have, will continue to take a responsible and prudent approach to the nation's finances. I've already spoken about the 5% revenue cap, which is one way of exerting that kind of responsibility and discipline. So I'm confident that whatever powers we have, we'll use them responsibly and in the broader interests of taxpayers, which will set us apart from our colleagues perhaps in other places. In terms of your specific question, if I can now, as I should do, come to that, yes, the priorities we set for deciding how we spend are as they were when we published the plan at the end of 2011, and the four areas of prioritisation we've set are delivering sustainable economic growth, managing the transition to a low-carbon economy, supporting the delivery of efficient and high-quality public services, and supporting employment and opportunity across Scotland. So these are the priorities that inform all of our decisions, as not just as when we set the 2011 plan, but also as we've had further opportunities to increase capital investment. So, you know, the four opportunities, I think they've been now where John Swinney has indicated increased capital investment: February 2012, June 2012, September 2012 and December 2012, where we were able to announce additional plans. They were informed by those priorities as well.
So has the Infrastructure Investment Board refined or updated its 2011 analysis against these priorities to reflect the current pipeline of programmes and projects?
Well, that's an ongoing process. The pipeline of both projects and programmes in the updated plan, the February plan, is obviously similar to what was included in the 2011 plan. What changes, what did change in that, is we added much more information about, you know, individual schools projects, for example, as part of the overall Schools for the Future programme, community hub projects, over £5 million that have been taken forward through the hub. So we have increased the accuracy, and the detail of the information in there. It's not so much that the identity of projects has radically changed. So we don't envisage that the assessment of the contribution of projects in terms of those prioritisation criteria will be very different to what was produced as part of the 2011 Infrastructure Investment Plan.
Is that type of information likely to be made available to us, or more available than it currently is, so that we can judge the fit between the priorities and the programme?
I'd be happy to look at what further information we could provide to the committee. I think it would be helpful for the committee to have that. As I say, the February plan is a refreshed plan in terms of the detail, and obviously the further down the line we go with projects, the more accurate information can become, the more accurate estimates and projections can become. So that's the change between the two, more than different projects are involved. But if it would be helpful to the committee, I'm happy to undertake to look at what further information we can provide to let you know what underpins our analysis of prioritisation, and make your own judgments about whether that what's in the pipeline fits the priorities that we've set.
I'd be very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, Adam?
Looking at the project pipeline, Cabinet Secretary, something like over 50% of the total capital value of £6.5 billion is accounted for. Is accounted by transport projects. What's your reflection on the sectoral split and how of these capital plans, and how these reflect the Scottish Government's priorities?
I mean, if you look at the total, as you say, transport projects account for about 50% of the total capital value of the projects in the pipeline. I think health is about a quarter of the total project pipeline value. Both transport and health are major priorities for the government. And if I refer you back to our four prioritisation criteria, delivering growth, transport investment is clearly very important around that. The delivery of efficient and high quality public services. I know, we all know, I know particularly from my background as Health Secretary, the importance of investment in the capital estate of the health service and making sure we can provide services in the best way possible. So I think that sectoral split certainly fits with the prioritisation that we have set. The other point I would make, though, is we have to be very mindful of the fact that when you're breaking down the overall pipeline by value, it will be skewed, if that's not a pejorative word, by very big projects. So transport, for example, inevitably reflects the fact that we've got the Forth Replacement Crossing, a massive project in that, likewise with health, the South Glasgow Hospitals project. So that skews that to some extent. We've also got within the programme, and I've referred to it on a few occasions already, we've got the Schools for the Future programme, which, although lower by value in terms of the impact that will have on our areas of priority, is significant. So I think the sectoral split does reflect our priorities, but you cannot get away from the fact that it is influenced by a small number of very large projects in one or two of these sectors.
So that you mentioned the schools projects. Now there's something like 19 school projects have no capital value attached in the project. Why is that? Is that a...
These are schools that were added at phase 3 of the programme. They are schools that are still in the development phase with the Scottish Futures Trust. For example, the maximum grant available to local authorities is one of the things that is being finalised. So this is an area where, I said in my opening remarks that, this pipeline of projects, the information will be added to as we've got information. So this is a good example of where that information will be added as it becomes available. Obviously, one of the good things about the Schools for the Future programme is that it's going to deliver, by the time all 3 stages are completed, it's going to deliver more schools than we originally anticipated it would, which is because partly, perhaps largely through the efforts of Scottish Futures Trust, they've got maximum value for money from the project.
That's excellent. Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. Could I move maybe now to procurement routes? And can I ask just a straightforward question, why are certain sectors more heavily dependent on revenue financing than others? For example, with the Justice, Culture and Enterprise projects are all conventionally financed. Why are schools and further education, for example, more dependent on revenue financing?
Well, again, I think that comes down to some of the projects that are involved. So, the total NPD programme, has a capital value of just over now £2.5 billion. But there's £1 billion of transport projects in there. The M8 bundle, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route, for example. You've got £830 million of education projects. The Sick Kids Hospital in health, and I think a total of £750 million of health projects as part of that. As part of that total £2.5 billion. There are some sectors in some areas where NPD is probably less appropriate as a financing route. If you take prisons, for example, use of revenue finance for investment is just a bit more complicated in terms of operation of the prison buildings without adding in the custodial services to that. And we've had a policy as a government since 2007 that all new prisons will be operated by the public sector. So the differences between sector will partly be because of the fact that certain types of project lend themselves more to the NPD route than others. But also, again, some big projects that we are financing through NPD in particular sectors will again skew the overall allocation between the different sectors.
Okay, so in terms of establishing or deciding upon which procurement route to take, are you focused? How do you do that?
Partly it will be down to availability of capital and the priority needs. So, if you take the Sick Kids, for example, a project I was very familiar with in my time as Health Secretary, if we hadn't gone down the NPD route there, that's a project that simply because of the cut to our traditional capital budget simply wouldn't have been able to happen. So it was a case of you do it by revenue financing, or you don't do it at all. And my view, and I'm sure everybody's view around this table, was that it's such an important project that we wanted it to go ahead. So, you know, often that decision will be driven very simply by the availability of capital. Secondly, though, it is the case that revenue finance is more suited to larger projects. It's more suited to larger projects that have ongoing maintenance needs. So, you know, sick kids, for example, roads projects are all better suited there. It is more suited to large projects, or where you can aggregate different smaller projects into a much larger bundle. So these are the kind of factors that influence our decision making there. I mean, interestingly, I think the smallest individually procured NPD project is the new Edinburgh Blood Transfusion Centre. The capital value of that is £36 million. So that again gives an indication that it's a type of financing that is better geared to the bigger capital projects, and often they will be in transport or health, for example.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Elaine.
Thanks, Convener. Could I just look, first of all, at the NPD financed projects, and you'll be well aware that there's been a significant discrepancy in the draft budget this year compared to the draft budget the year before, some £681 million less between 2012 and 2014 than there was anticipated in the previous year's draft budget. Given that there has been that discrepancy over the period of a year, how confident can you be that you will deliver £131 million worth of NPD finance capital investment by the end of the spending review period?
I would challenge your use of the word discrepancy. I mean, that suggests there is, you know, something kind of untoward about it. What we have done right from the inception, really, of the NPD programme is provide estimates of the profile of spend. Now, as we have progressed in time, as the SFT have done the work that is required, the very detailed, very complex work. I mean, we're talking here about 50 complex projects involving, I think, somewhere in the region of 30 different procuring authorities. Then those estimates have become more accurate as we've gone along. Now, I think that is the appropriate way to provide information to Parliament, and I don't think it is reasonable to describe that as a discrepancy. It's a case of information becoming more refined and more developed, and therefore more accurate as we've gone on. I'm confident in the NPD programme. You know, clearly as the work progresses, as we see more projects go into procurement, we've got a number of projects that will go into construction in this year, the financial year about to start at the start of April, then the figures and the information that's been provided to Parliament becomes ever more robust and ever more reliable. So I'm confident in the figures, and I'm confident, absolutely confident, that £2.5 billion total will be invested in full, and the country will have the assets across the range of sectors that are impacted on to show for that, and that's a thoroughly good thing.
Still £681 million less invested in the Scottish economy over 2 years than had been trumpeted in the draft budget the year before. So it is a discrepancy in my view. But can we just look at, you know, what is the reason behind it? Do you accept that NPD is a form of PPP?
NPD is a form of revenue financing, yes. But, you know, as we've said, it is a form of revenue finance that is infinitely, in many different ways, better than PFI. And, you know, the UK government, much later and more belated than the Scottish government, has also woken up to the deficiencies of PFI and is, you know, now saying that it's going to make refinements and improvements to that. So, you know, NPD in terms of capping the profits to private sector, etc., gets more value for money, and therefore it's a way of making sure that in a time when our budget is being cut over the spending review, just to remind people, our capital budget has been reduced by 26%, less than the 33% that Alistair Darling was planning to cut it by, granted, but still 26% reduction. So NPD allows you to deliver projects that wouldn't be possible otherwise. I've already mentioned the sick kids only being made possible because of routes like this, but it allows you to do it in a way that doesn't have some of the glaring deficiencies that the PFI scheme, so beloved of past administrations, had.
Well, PPP was a refinement of PFI, and PPP also evolved over a period of time. Indeed, actually, NPD was used in by the previous administration as well. So what I cannot understand, given the experience in revenue, what you like to describe as revenue financed investment, given the years of experience on that, what has been the problem which has resulted in a £681 million reduction over a period of 2 years in the investment which can be delivered through that model? I mean, what actually has been the problem that the Scottish Futures Trust has run into over the last year, which has so significantly changed that estimate?
Okay. I mean, these are, as I say, 50 big complex projects involving 30 or so procuring authorities. In a moment, I'll take you through project by project some of the issues. But I do, you know, I totally understand why you want to use some of the language you're using, but, you know, I do have to take issue with it. Just as I took issue with discrepancy, reduction implies that this is investment that will not happen. The profile of the investment has changed. The investment will happen, but the profile of spend has changed. So, you know, I think in trying to use language like that, you give a misleading impression of what's happening in the NPD programme. But I understand the factors that lie behind that. Just let me take you through some projects. You know, look at Borders Rail. You know, a decision was taken to deliver that project through RAB rather than NPD. So that was one material change. The M8 bundle decision was taken to de-risk that project and to deliver utilities first, financed through capital funding separate to the main NPD contract. I think a decision that was sensible. Colleges, we awaited the outcome of the 2011 spending review to give us more clarity over the availability of enabling funds prior to going to market with these projects. Schools, I mean, and what you've got to understand with schools is that the procuring authorities are individual local authorities. There are decisions to be taken there in terms of location of projects, the timing of projects, the decision making there. So there's a range of different issues at play. But the key thing here is, and this, you know, I think it will be borne out, is the time taken in these projects to get it right in the early stages will mean that we deliver more value for money, that we will deliver shorter timescales when it comes to the procurement of these projects than would be the case if SFT and the authorities involved didn't do that detailed work in advance. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, and I repeat the point I made at the outset. We're not talking about a reduction in a programme here. You know, if anything, the £2.5 billion that we promised at the start of the spending review will be higher than that. The profile of the spend has changed. The investment will still take place and the projects will be delivered.
Clearly, I mean, time will tell. I mean, you know,
time will tell. Yeah.
Time will tell whether that is actually the case or not. Could I move on possibly to just in passing? I mean, I thought Borders Rail, the mechanism for funding Borders Rail had changed because nobody was interested in taking up the NPD model for Borders Rail. But
it's still changed.
It's still changed, but it's not because it's some judgment of the SFT that it changed. It was because they couldn't get a partner to come into that project. But if we could move on, because we were talking about, you were talking earlier about the cap, and can you advise us whether the 4% cap for NPD and PFI payments relating to the revenue finance and the total of 5% cap, including debt repayments such as RAB, and presumably the new capital borrowing powers which are coming in, are those caps still in place? It's
a 5% cap that we focus on, and that is, I said earlier on, very much still in place. We set that cap on the future revenue commitments that will be related to capital investment, and that's a maximum of 5% of our expected future annual total DEL budget. And the revenue commitments will include not just future debt repayments of any capital borrowing that we do in future, or payments under the NPD model or RAB, but also includes existing PFI commitments, so inherited commitments from previous administrations related to previous projects. But the 5% cap is the one we focus on.
Is that sort of information likely to be in the public domain? Is that going to be published in terms of the assessment and the actual repayments?
The there is information already in the public domain in terms of this spending review. So, you know, we can already look at this year, next year and 14-15. So revenue financed investment is a percentage of resource, DEL 3.4, 3.5, 3.9 over these 3 years, total DEL 3.1, 3.3 and 3.6. And these are already published, I think, in the spending review document.
In terms of that, I mean, I've found it certainly quite difficult to find the detail of individual projects that are projected spend on, say, Borders Rail compared to Egypt or so on. That information doesn't seem to be available in the budget, and the budget documents only go as far as level 3 on some of these sorts of projects. Is there any plans in the future to make that sort of information available?
I mean, in the interest of as much transparency, I provide as much information to the committee as I can. But obviously, we monitor our revenue commitments in terms of that overall 5% cap, and the projections for where we are in relation to that 5% cap will be published spending review by spending review. We've already published that information for this spending review, and no doubt we will do the same in the next spending review.
It's slightly off the track, but it does make sometimes the monitoring of what's happening on the budget, that some of these items are not certainly not published at level 4. I'm sure they exist somewhere at level 4, but we don't seem to have access to those figures at level 4 for some projects.
As with any request for information, I'm more than happy to go away and look at what further information we can provide to the committee. But, you know, on the cap, I mean, I would hope all members would think this is actually a welcome move in the right direction, because, you know, to go back to some of the comments I made in response to Alec Johnson, it is a device by which we can ensure that there is responsibility and discipline in our budget, that if we are borrowing money, which all revenue forms of finance are effectively borrowing money to pay for projects now that have to be paid back over a period of time, that we're doing so responsibly, that we're not running up levels of repayment that are unsustainable. Because, you know, what you find in the PFI legacy in budgets like education or even in health, the legacy of that in terms of the year-on-year revenue budgets of these portfolios is significant. So it's really important that we ensure that that's at a sustainable level, and that cap helps us to do so, and I think it's a very sound judgment to have introduced it.
Can I ask if that gives you a problem in terms of boosting, if we got to the position of boosting capital spending, if you're keeping within a particular cap? I understand we've got quite a heavy legacy from PFI payments. So, I mean, how much room for manoeuvre do you have with a cap such as that?
Well, our planning forward in terms of the pipeline that we're talking about today, you know, we are, you know, confident that we can take the decisions that need to be taken to deliver that within the cap that we've set. It stands to reason, and it goes without saying, although I'm about to say it, that the PFI legacy takes away some of the room for manoeuvre that we might otherwise have. And, you know, clearly any government at any time can review the level at which it sets a cap like that, but increasing that has a real impact on budgets in the here and now, because it takes away, you know, to use the example of health, which I frequently use because I know it best, you know, if you go over that cap, even if you're doing it for good reasons of trying to boost the economy, to spend more in the short term, then it's less money in the here and now that can be spent on, you know, the revenue needs of the health service. So there needs to be a real sense of responsibility and discipline around that.
The other thing I was just wanted to follow up on was the Scottish Futures Trust and how successful it has been in terms of getting more bang for our buck, to use that horrible expression. You mentioned earlier that extra school projects were coming on stream because of that. Is there a possibility that the NPD programme we might be able to squeeze some more out of it as a consequence of the work that the SFT is doing?
Well, the SFT, I think, is doing great work, and will, you know, always be looking to see where it can squeeze more value, because the more value you can get out of projects, then the more you have to invest. I've mentioned the schools work that has, because of the approach taken there and the value and the savings that have been made. We can do more schools than we originally anticipated, which is fantastic. The overall savings that SFT have been estimated to have delivered since 2008 are, I think, £370 million overall, 130 of that in 11-12, I think. So they are having a significant impact that is allowing us, to use the phrase we don't like, get more bangs for our buck, which is really important, and they'll continue to do that, because I think at any time it's important to get as much value as possible, but particularly when resources are as constrained as they are just now, the more we can bear down on cost, be more efficient, get more value, then the more we're going to be able to do.
Margaret?
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Moving on to projects in the pipeline. The project pipeline actually provides details of 103 projects. However, 68% of those projects are in preparation, i.e. they do not yet have an outline business case. Can you tell me why there is such a high number of projects in the pipeline which don't have an outline business case yet?
The pipeline, as you say, has 103 projects in it in total. It includes a large number of schools projects that are included in the overall Schools for the Future programme. These are nominated by local authorities on the basis of schools that they deem are most in need of repair or replacement, and these don't yet have an outline business case, but obviously as they move forward that information becomes more detailed. Obviously, if a project is included in the infrastructure investment plan, if it's in the investment pipeline, then we've made a judgment that we're confident that it will proceed. And normally projects, certainly projects over £20 million would be included in the IIP when an outline business case has been prepared, or whatever the equivalent of that is for hub and RAB projects. So that would be the norm, but the particular situation is, as I've just said, around the schools.
Okay, thank you. You've actually answered my other two questions as well at the same time.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Very efficient.
Okay. Jim, then we'll move on to your questions.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I could probe you on some of the fine detail of the infrastructure investment plan. You talked about the global scale of capital investment, but if we could come down to some of the nuts and bolts of that. And I'm keen to understand as well what informs the decisions that are taken in terms of the changes to the estimates of the profile of spend. I hope I've got my terminology correct there in view of earlier discussions. Because there are some projects that are estimated to have their capital value reduced by more than 10 million. And there are some projects that are estimated to have their capital value increased by more than 10 million. So I'm thinking in the first category of projects like the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and Department for Clinical Neurosciences, where the capital value of the project is estimated to be reduced. What underpins that type of decision? Is it that the scope of the project has changed, or is it an attempt to extract as much value as possible through efficiencies? I'm using that as an example, but there are clearly a number of projects within that category. Let
me do my best to try and answer that as fully as possible, but again, it may be an area where it would be helpful to the committee to, project by project, have some more information in writing. If I can take, firstly, projects where the costs or the anticipated costs are lower in the update than they were in the 2011 plan. There's a lot of health projects that fall into that category. The figures, usually that is a result of the figures used in the original plan being prior to the submission of outline business cases to government for approval. It will also cover issues like, and this is the case for MPD projects, original estimates might include capital enabling works and in addition to the capital costs of construction, where the MPD costs are only looking at the costs of construction, and because they don't form part of the unitary payment, they're no longer included in the schedule of costs. So these are the kind of reasons that would tend to explain where costs now are lower. So often it will be simply a refinement of the costs and the costs that are appropriate to be in that projection where you've got costs that are lower. In terms of where costs are higher, again, this will vary very much from project to project. So if I can give, just a couple of instances of that, the A96 dual carriageway, it's at a very early stage of development, so it's very difficult to give an estimate of the cost of dualling between Inverness and Aberdeen, for example. But as the design and preparation of that progresses, we get a more detailed estimate of that. So that allows us to get more exact, not absolutely exact, but more exact about the estimates we're making. Another category of area, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, clearly there are particular issues there in terms of the delay to that project as a result of the lengthy court challenges. That's increased the cost. Inflation, for example, has been the biggest factor there, so that will account for the differences in that project. So these are just a couple of examples. I could go through project by project more of the detail of that, but it might be helpful to deliver that more to the committee in writing, if that would be helpful.
That's always helpful. But you can understand that sometimes the public will have a suspicion that, particularly in a time of constrained budgets, that perhaps the project is being scaled back in some way when they see the value of capital value being reduced. So is there any reassurance that you can provide?
I mean,
on that point?
What you've got to remember is that we're looking at these projects in an infrastructure investment plan that deals with, the projected timescales, the projected cost, the route of financing, for example. All of these projects or many of these projects are projects that are very important to local communities. And, if it's a health facility, for example, will have gone through a lot of discussion and dialogue locally. So there'll be a degree of accountability locally for the health board if a project that was envisaged to be of a certain scope is reduced in scope. Similarly with schools, for example. So, we're looking at it in the global context. There's very close scrutiny at a local level over these individual projects. And if there is change to the scope of a project or change materially to what is being delivered, then that should be something that is open and transparent. But what we're dealing with here in many, if not all of the cases I'm talking about here, is I suppose this is I think it's a good thing that we have this amount of information and we update this information regularly. But I suppose the downside of that is as you get more accurate and more refined in the estimates and the projections you can make, there will be changes along the way. And often those changes will come from better value for money, better deals being struck, more refinement about what, particularly in big transport projects that take place over a long number of years, you get more accurate with the costs the closer you get to them. So these are more, I think, more in the realms of explanations than your suspicious mind might suggest in terms of trying to reduce the scale of projects. A healthy suspicious mind, I should say.
I'm never suspicious, but always sceptical on behalf of the public.
Good. Excellent.
Can I ask you about a specific project in that case where there has been some interest expressed? Future communication, the Emergency Services Future Communications Programme. In the 2011 Infrastructure Investment Plan, there was an identified cost of £500 million, a not insignificant investment for the project to be delivered between 2016 and 2020. The 2013 update doesn't seem to have the same level of detail, and here I'm perhaps looking to the officials to provide us with an explanation as to why there seems to be less detail available, and if that is information that can be provided to the
maybe give it in general terms, and then I'm happy to let any of the officials here, maybe Vicky can say a bit more, but if not, we'll provide this in writing to you. I mean, you're dealing here with ongoing work to produce outline business cases, and inevitably until these business cases are produced, and even sometimes after the business cases are produced, there is always a degree of uncertainty about what solution to adopt, how much that solution will cost. Ultimately, the procurement decisions on what to adopt will be guided by the views of services themselves, it will be influenced by what features those services want to accept or decline, bearing in mind the cost implications of all of that. So essentially, at the nub of this, the difference between the 2011 plan and the current plan is that previously we were trying to give, ballpark upper limits of the anticipated expenditure, whereas this time we're able to more candidly declare that it's too soon to say with certainty what some of the costs might be. So that's the kind of brief ballpark explanation, but I'm happy to provide a lot more detailed explanation around some of these variances if you would find that helpful.
Yes, okay, that is helpful. And just finally, and here I'm looking to officials, more technical questions of detail. Why has the programme and project information been presented separately in the update? And could you tell us what your formal distinction definition is of a programme as distinct from a project?
I'm touched by your lack of confidence in me to give technical detail. Basically, programmes are... Vicky will do this so much more technically than I can. Projects are kind of discrete projects. Programmes are kind of groups of projects. So the schools programme, for example, is a number of discrete projects, or the A9 dualling, for example, will be an overall programme that has a number of discrete bits of work within it. So that's the distinction between programme and project in a not very technical fashion. Vicky, do you want to put the technicalities around it?
Well, I mean, in a sense, DFM's just explained it. I mean, a project is a single piece of infrastructure investment like a school. A programme is a set of related projects and activities. And we have wanted to produce two separate pipelines because there was a desire to put out much more detailed information about individual projects to inform the market, like when projects would be advertised to the market, expected construction start date, and when the project would be operational. So we decided it was decided that we would have two different pipelines so that we could provide a lot more information about what was happening with regard to individual projects.
Formal distinction, definition.
I mean, in a sense, it's as we've just described. A project is a single discrete piece of infrastructure investment. A programme covers a set of related projects or activities. Like for example, affordable housing, we've included that as a programme. That includes, the capital grant provision to local authorities and RSLs, and so we have, it's an entire programme of related activity to deliver a certain outcome.
But in presenting them both, it's designed to give the overall overview, because you will have some programmes where individual bits of that programme are also in the project list as a discrete project. So it's not it's not meant to be a very technical distinction. It is meant to distinguish between discrete standalone projects and clusters of projects that are related to each other, and might be procured in a different way because of that.
Thank you.
Okay, Jimmy, you finished your questions? Yep, okay. Margaret, you want to ask some on broadband infrastructure?
Yeah. About the broadband infrastructure in Scotland, procurement for the Highlands and Islands area has been awarded, and Highland and Islands Enterprise, which is also leading the procurement, has confirmed that once the contract details have been finalised and signed, the contractor will be announced, right? In relation to the rest of Scotland procurement, the invitation to tender was issued in January 2013, and plans seem to be on track for the contract to be awarded by the end of June. Can you provide an update on the progress in relation to each of the procurement contracts, please?
Yes, I can. I think you've quite accurately given the update in your question there. The Highlands and Islands is started first and is the more advanced of the two programmes. It's in the final stages of the procurement process. All contractual principles have been agreed. The project is being assured by BD UK. The contract award in the Highlands and Islands is expected very soon, hopefully before the end of this month. In terms of the rest of Scotland, the formal tender process commenced in September last year. There was then a very detailed supplier engagement process. The invitation to tender was issued in January of this year. The project remains on track and committed to award the final contract by June this year. So that's the broad time table for both of the projects.
And the first annual progress report states that achieving the 2015 target is about setting a minimum level of coverage in each local authority, and that it will then be for individual councils to determine whether and how they wish to extend and fund that level of coverage. Are you able to give an indication of the level of interest, both from local authority and a commercial perspective, on the development of broadband infrastructure in Scotland?
I will do that as briefly as possible. Again, I think this is because this is an area where there's a lot of detail underpinning my answer, so it probably would be a useful time anyway to give the committee an update on the step change programme in terms of where we are with the contracts, and once we've got contract awards, exactly what those contracts are going to deliver. In broad terms, we've secured more than £240 million of public sector funding for the step change programme, which will extend next generation broadband into rural areas. We're committed to providing a minimum level of coverage across all local authority areas from national funding, and in discussion with COSLA and local authorities, that threshold has been set at 75%. On top of that, local authorities are being encouraged to make additional contributions to step change so that they can increase either coverage or speed in their own areas. So far, I think 14 local authorities have indicatively committed additional funding to address their own particular local priorities. We work very closely with individual local authorities in this programme, and I also engage, and my officials engage very closely with COSLA around the delivery of this. So it's very important work. It's work that's progressing well, but you will appreciate, given the nature and the scale of the work, there are a number of challenges along the way. So I'm happy, perhaps once the Highlands and Islands contract is awarded, to provide a written update to the committee, which will set out exactly where we are across the two programmes.
I must say I find the funding of broadband projects extremely complicated, because not only is it Scottish Government, but the UK Government and Europe are also involved with funding. For example, when we talked about broadband with your predecessor, he said that the Aberdeen City and Shire project, which was well advanced, shouldn't be held up because other areas of the country are not at the stage of development of that ACCEF is. And I understand it that on the 5th of December, in the Chancellor's autumn statement, he announced the 12 cities that could get broadband funding, of which Aberdeen was one. And now we find that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport has failed to resolve their state aid issues with the EU, and that's still in discussion. So, it all seems very complicated and stuck in disputes, if you...
Again, I'm happy to cover these points in a written update to the committee. The state aid issue was certainly one of the issues that delayed progress with the Highlands and Islands part of the programme. That is resolved now in terms of the state aid issue, but I can provide more information around that to the committee. I mean, the funding does come from different sources. Of the 240 million that I spoke about, just under 150 million of that comes from the Scottish budget, but that includes, our Next Generation Digital Fund, includes some Barnett consequentials, and it includes about £20 million of EU funds. We've then got about £100 million from the UK Government and about £10 million from the Urban Broadband Fund. So that's the broad makeup of the 240. As I said in response to Margaret, there's a number of local authorities that have identified funding over and above that, which stands at somewhere in the region of about £50 million at the moment. So, there are complicated issues in progressing this, but through the two-step change programmes, I'm very keen to say that we are making progress in order to get to the level of coverage that people have a right to expect, because this is a fundamental part and an increasingly fundamental part of the country's infrastructure. But given its complexity and given the different funding sources and the different aspects to this, it would probably be helpful to the committee to get a full written update, and perhaps an appropriate point. I hesitate to say this, but a dedicated kind of evidence session, if the committee was interested, might be appropriate around this programme.
Yes, I think, and also in relation to that, the World Class 2020 target is obviously important as well. So maybe just briefly at this point then, can you describe what work the Scottish Government plans to undertake as part of the Digital Dialogue programme, and how you plan to use the research in the Digital Scotland 2020 study?
Well, the 2020 study is obviously an important part of our deliberations around this, because it gives us a good overview of what we're looking at here. I think I've either just recently or just about to write to the committee, just setting out our plans around what we've described or are describing as Scotland's Digital Dialogue, which is a programme of engagement, seminars, talks that are designed to help us communicate and refine the world-class plans that we've got. So that programme of dialogue is taking place from now through to May. There's a website being set up to help with that, and it will feature some of the key information around that. And what we're seeking to do here is encourage not just businesses and organisations, but individuals, if we can, to contribute to what we're trying to achieve, what we mean by world class, what we're trying to achieve by world class, and start to look at how we, using the step change as a foundation, build on that. And we would welcome, I think this was the purpose of writing to the committee, we would welcome the committee's input to that.
We did get that letter yesterday, Cabinet Secretary, thank you. Anyone else got any further questions? No? Okay. Can I thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and your officials for that session today. It's been very useful. Can I briefly suspend the meeting to allow the witnesses to leave the room, and at this point we move into private session.